I didn't realize just how much American schools shape the way that I think until I left the country. And I'm not talking about what I learned academically. I'm talking about the things that I absorbed without even realizing it. About work, about obedience, about success. At the time, all of it felt completely normal. It wasn't until I moved abroad that some of these lessons started to fall apart. This video is about 5 things that we're taught early as Americans that shape the way we live our lives as adults and start to make a lot less sense once we finally step outside of them. One of the first things that started to feel strange to me after living abroad was how much emphasis Americans put on being nice. And I don't mean kind, I mean pleasant, agreeable, non-confrontational. In the US, we're taught pretty early that being nice means not making things uncomfortable. So instead of saying what we actually think, we soften it. We smile, we add extra words, we avoid saying things directly. Think about just how often we say things like, no worries at all, when there are, in fact, many worries. Or, it's totally fine, when something isn't, and the famous, let me get back to you, when we already know that the answer is no. None of that is dishonest in a dramatic way. It's just indirect. And growing up, that makes sense. You're rewarded for being easy to work with, for not causing problems, for keeping things smooth. Discomfort is treated like something to avoid and not like something to work through. But when you take that habit abroad, especially in places like France or most of Europe, it starts to break down because directness isn't seen as rude there. It's seen as efficient, respectful, clear. So when someone tells you plainly, no, that doesn't work, or I don't agree, they're not being cold, they're just being honest. And this is where the culture shock really hits, because Americans often walk away thinking, wow, that felt really harsh, while the other person walks away thinking, that was just a normal conversation. The misunderstanding isn't about the tone that the person used. It's about what we're taught politeness is supposed to look like. In the US, politeness means protecting feelings. In Europe, politeness often means respecting reality. And once you start noticing this pattern, you start to see it everywhere. At work, in friendships, in feedback, in conflict. We're trained to smooth things over instead of just saying what's true. And that habit doesn't just shape the way that we talk to people. It shapes how comfortable we are with discomfort in general. And that matters a lot more than it sounds. One of the clearest lessons we learned growing up in the US is this. Being productive means being worthy, and it starts early. In school, productivity isn't just encouraged, it's rewarded. Perfect attendance becomes a badge of honor. Showing up no matter what is framed as responsibility. You're praised for pushing through a sickness, for never missing a day, for being reliable, and being busy is treated as proof that you're doing something right. More homework, more activities, a schedule that's always full. Rest isn't built into the system. It's something that you squeeze in around the edges. And what you're really learning isn't time management. You're learning that endurance is a virtue. That if you push through discomfort, you're doing life correctly. And that lesson sticks with you. When you leave school, the structure changes, but the lesson doesn't. In work culture, being busy is treated as a moral signal. You're respected for staying late, for answering emails quickly, for powering through your exhaustion. Hustle becomes a stand-in for responsibility. And rest starts to feel like something that you have to justify. So even when no one is explicitly telling you to work harder, you feel it. You feel guilty for slowing down. You feel anxious when your calendar isn't full. You feel like you need to earn your downtime. This is where things start to crack when you live abroad. Because in many European cultures, rest isn't treated as a reward. It's treated as part of the structure. Time off is expected. Sick days are normal. Pace matters. So Americans often arrive feeling like they need to prove themselves, even when no one asks them to. And once you learn that your worth is proven through endurance, it makes sense that questioning the system feels uncomfortable. It makes sense that slowing down feels wrong, because this isn't just about work, it's about identity. And this is where it stopped feeling like a set of habits and started feeling like something much deeper, the excessive patriotism. And I don't mean the loud, obvious stuff like slogans, hats, or flags on clothing. I mean the quiet, everyday version, the kind that we grow up with, saying the Pledge of Allegiance every morning at school, standing for the national anthem before sports games, flags in classrooms, flags in hallways, flags at assemblies, flags on front porches, flags on car bumpers. None of that was optional, and none of it felt extreme at the time. It just felt normal. So normal that you don't even think of it as a belief. It's just part of the environment you're raised in. And it wasn't until I lived abroad that I had a moment of distance. And once you step outside of that environment, you realize is something a little uncomfortable. If another country asked children to pledge loyalty every day, filled schools with national symbols, and built rituals of loyalty into ordinary events, we'd probably call that propaganda. And I don't say that as an accusation, I say it as an observation. When something is introduced to you as a child, before you even have the words to question it, it doesn't feel political. It doesn't feel like an opinion. It just feels like how the world works. And that's the part that's easy to miss, because you're not asked whether or not you agree with it. You're not invited to think about it. You're just expected to grow up inside of it. In many parts of Europe, patriotism exists, but it shows up very differently. You don't repeat loyalty statements every day. You don't perform national identity as part of your routine. And that doesn't mean that people care less about their country. It means that national identity isn't constantly reinforced through repetition. And that difference matters. Because when loyalty becomes habitual, questioning it feels like a betrayal. So later in life, when people start questioning systems, work, government, culture, expectations, it doesn't just feel challenging, it feels wrong. So once we understand that this conditioning happens early, it becomes easier to see why most Americans feel like following the rules feels safer than challenging them, and why stepping outside the expected path can make you feel anxious or disloyal, even when it makes logical sense. When you grow up inside systems where loyalty is pushed so heavily, authority starts to feel personal. Not because anyone explicitly tells you not to question it, but because questioning authority feels like crossing a line. In school, you're taught to follow rules before you're taught how to evaluate them. You're rewarded for compliance, for doing what's expected, for staying in line, for not causing problems. And over time, that turns into something deeper. You don't just learn how to follow rules. You learn that good people follow the rules. And this is where loyalty gets confused with obedience. Because in the US especially, criticism is often framed as negativity. If you question something, it's usually framed as complaining or as being ungrateful. So instead of asking, is this system working? We ask, am I allowed to question this? That's a very different mindset. And this is why leaving the country, or even seriously questioning life back home, can feel so emotionally charged. Not because you hate where you came from, but because leaving can feel like a rejection, like you're being disloyal, like you're turning your back on something that you were taught to respect. Whether they realize it or not, that's a tension that a lot of people sit with. On the one hand, things in the US aren't working for them anymore. On the other hand, questioning it feels wrong. So they stay stuck in the middle. And not because of lack of information, but because they've been taught that following the rules is part of being a good person. They don't stay in the US because they lack options. They stay because leaving feels like breaking a rule. And when all of these lessons start to stack on top of each other, they form something that most of us don't realize we've been following since day one: a script. In the US, there's a very clear idea of how a good life is supposed to unfold. You're a good student, so you go to a good college, then you get a good job. You work really hard, you stay really busy, and eventually you're rewarded with visible success. And the key word here is visible, because in the US, success isn't just something you're supposed to feel, it's something you're supposed to show. A job title that makes sense, a lifestyle that looks impressive, a pace of life that signals ambition. And within that script, life is always scheduled for later. You work now, and you rest later. You enjoy yourself once you've earned it. Burnout is often treated like a phase of life that you're supposed to push through, and not a sign that the setup itself isn't working. And exhaustion becomes something you normalize. This is also where convenience starts to win over quality. Faster is treated as better. More efficient is treated as better. And scaling up is treated as progress, even when the actual experience gets worse. Food is an easy place to see this. Meals are designed to be quicker, cheaper, and easier to produce at scale. So ingredients get simplified, flavors get flatter, and eating becomes about speed and calories, and not enjoyment or quality. You're encouraged to eat in your car, eat at your desk, eat while doing something else. But it's not just food. It also shows up at work. Emails replace conversations, meetings replace thinking. Everything is optimized to move faster, even when it creates more confusion. It shows up in how we spend our time. Errands get bundled, schedules get packed, free time becomes something that you squeeze in between obligations, and slowing down starts to feel irresponsible. So your days feel tighter. You're always moving, but you're rarely getting anywhere. And life starts to feel like something you're constantly managing, not something that you're actually present for. And this is why life in Europe often feels slower to Americans. Not because people in Europe are less ambitious, but because the script is different. Life isn't treated as something you postpone. Time is part of the value. Rest is built in. And success doesn't always need to announce itself. And this is the part people don't talk about. When you step outside the American life script, it can almost feel like you're falling behind, even if your life actually feels better, because the markers that you've been taught to measure yourself by no longer apply. And without those markers, it's easy to mistake alignment for failure. And that's why so many people today feel so burnt out, restless, and anxious, even when they've done everything right, even when they've perfectly followed the life script, because the script simply wasn't designed to be sustainable. And once you see that script for what it is, you get a choice that you didn't realize you had. You can keep chasing the version of success you were taught to perform, or you can start defining a life that actually works for you. And even with that perspective, seeing the US from the outside doesn't mean that I don't miss parts of it. There are things that I genuinely loved and still love about living there, but that doesn't undo what you notice once you finally step outside the system.